Like I was saying, you can pin us now for the beginning of our segment here, and then we're ready to start. Yeah, so wonderful. It is great to have Grace Rachmany with me here today. And before we get started, I'm going to just give a little bit of context for today, and then we'll get into what I hope will be a fascinating conversation, at least for me, because there's lots to learn. Yeah, so as you know, the Money Talk series is part of sort of the bigger universe of expanding our consciousness and comfort to talk about all things money and everything that is somehow connected and related to this universe, which is of course a bit cheeky because everything is somehow connected to this universe of money. And my name is Nadezhda Taranchevsky. If you don't know me yet, I'm one of the co-founders of Conscious You, and we're specialized in facilitating collective transformation through scalable online coaching programs. And one of those programs is called See You Money. And I wrote this program together with my mentor, Peter Koenig, who has developed a very unique approach to money work. And that was really my introduction into the world of money when I met Peter some 15 years ago. So today, what will happen is I will have an interview with Grace, who I will introduce in a minute. And there will be a segment of about 20, 25 minutes where I'll be talking to Grace with questions that I have prepared and talk to her about in previous to this conversation today. And then we'll open the room for all of your questions and hopefully get deeper into the topic of DAOs. Yeah, so it is my pleasure, Grace, to have you here today. So Grace is an expert in ICOs, which are initial coin offerings, and maybe she'll tell us a bit more about that as well, and business models related to that, and tokenomics. And she is the founder of iWriteICOWhitepapers.com. She's also co-author of a book called So You've Got a DAO, Handbook for Distributed and Connected Leadership. And she trains leaders in the DAO space. And Grace has over 20 years of experience in supporting multidisciplinary and multicultural teams as a consultant, as a coach, and as a sparring partner through her company, DAO Leadership. And we'll post a link to Grace's company later so that if you want to know more, you can. Yeah, so Grace, it is my great pleasure to have you here today. And if you would love to maybe give us a little bit of a connection on a personal level for yourself around some questions that I have prepared around money and your relationship with money. And specifically, my questions sort of were, what did you actually learn about money when growing up? How does this influence the work you are passionate about today? And what is a dream that you have for the world?
Cool. So first of all, I really want to thank you for introducing me that I have more than 20 years of experience, because that gives me, makes me seem 10 years younger than I really am. And so, yeah, so it's funny. I grew up in the 80s and Reaganomics and this whole idea of trickle-down economics. I grew up in the United States. I'm a fifth-generation American, and I grew up with this sort of believing this stuff, you don't, people who are poor, it's because they didn't work hard, and anybody can succeed, and sort of these myths of, that were perpetrated by this whole idea of capitalism and extreme capitalism in some ways, right? It's just, everybody has a chance, and everybody has to contribute to society, and everybody and anybody could make it, which is quite clearly empirically untrue. And I also grew up with this idea of equality, that I was going to have the same chances as men, even though I know that subconsciously I could see that wasn't true. All of my heroes, I read the boys' comic books, and all of my heroes were men, and I could see again empirically that it wasn't true, but somehow I just bought this idea. And I have an MBA. I also, there was certainly a time when I felt like all this chasing after money is a bad idea, and I would never study business, which of course I did eventually, because entrepreneurship was really a way of developing myself. And in fact, it's one of the main ways of developing yourself, or has been, right? Growing a business and stuff like that. And I was taught that the way that you should do that is that you should You work hard and you earn money and you put money away and then you save for your retirement and then you retire. And there is no such thing as getting rich quick. And wow, that really doesn't look like what's going on either. And you should never get in debt. I mean, I was taught these very conservative values about money, and I think there were a lot of ways in which that kept me down for a long time, kept me from not being an entrepreneur, not wanting to, or not seeing that, well, if you're in business, you take some loans out, and that's part of how you do it. If you want to grow your business, or if you're in business, you take risks, and it's not about this steady thing. And yes, it is possible to get rich faster or to accumulate wealth faster. I mean, is that good or is that bad is another question, but it's, I think that I very much limited myself in terms of how much I could earn for a long time in my career. So that's kind of how that's influenced me.
And sort of the, last question, which is also maybe the question for the very end of our conversation, but I'm still interested. What is a dream that you have for the world based on all of that and your observations and your life as an entrepreneur?
Well, I mean, I think our dreams are very similar for the world, and I work on rather large-scale solutions, but I really see a world where there's no unnecessary death, and that includes both trees and butterflies and people. It's like we live in a world where we care for one another and we steward the earth, and I say that very specifically about no unnecessary death, because I think we all have this sort of, we have to agree on our values before we go for it. And I think we can all agree that if there's enough food for everybody, nobody should starve to death. And if there's technology to save people's lives, not that that would be relevant today, but everybody should have access to it, right? And you can see the tragic consequences of, for example, patent law today. The patent law is more important than saving people's lives. I mean, that's the most, it's just the most perverse thing of capitalism, and we're just seeing it in consequences everywhere today, and it's very obvious. So just people not dying when it's unnecessary would be a really good start.
I fully agree. But, I also continue to be baffled that things that appear to be nearly even common sense for you, for me, for probably everybody who joined us on this call today and who's watching. And hello, by the way, to everyone who's here. Wonderful for you to join. That clearly that's not necessarily something that is shared by all people on this planet, because if it was, we wouldn't be needing to have these conversations in quite the same way as we're having them today. So that actually brings me though into the topic of today's conversation, which is about DAOs. So firstly, I think it's a wonderful little abbreviation, but it doesn't maybe mean what some people might think it means. So I would be delighted if you could enlighten us. What is a DAO?
Yeah, well, people certainly don't agree on it, even in the decentralized field, right? So the idea behind a decentralized autonomous organization is that it would be decentralized. So the organization would not be hierarchical coming down from above, and that it would be autonomous. Now, we have some disagreement about what autonomous means. Does autonomous means that it would be run without human intervention? Or does autonomous mean that each, let's call it node of the system, would be autonomous, so that if you struck one node out, it could not make vulnerability for the other nodes? So you could think about the internet like that, right? Each node of the internet operates, and if you knock out one node, you can't knock out the internet. So that's another meaning of autonomous. And so some people think autonomous means that code is law, which means people are no longer needed. And if there's a law, it just gets executed in code and we're all good, which is bizarrely, a lot of people think is a good idea. As if there's no subtlety in the world and there's no nuance. And then organization, I think we know what an organization is. I mean, some things, and so that's the dream, right? That's the idea of what this decentralized autonomous organization is. And if you look at the implementation today, it's something quite rudimentary, which is normal, right? A new technology, it's kind of a clunky first attempt at something. And so what decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, as they're known in the cryptocurrency field, do is they allow people to vote on proposals and then have at least some of those proposals execute automatically, the autonomous part. So a proposal might be, let's fund Nadia's podcast. And Nadia puts out a podcast and she she recruits all you guys, and we all say yes, and we vote for it. And in a DAO, as soon as the vote passes, the Ethereum is sent to your wallet. So it's really interesting implementation. We've never had anything like that before. Because, and I've seen a very interesting implementation of that, for example, with DORG, which is an organization of a bunch of software engineers, like 20 guys or something, 30 guys. And instead of a CFO, that's what they have. All the funds are held in a wallet on the blockchain. And every 2 weeks, they submit their work, and all of them vote on each other's work, and then their salaries are paid that way. So that's interesting, right? It's all of a sudden it's not the CFO, because we've all had that experience of being a contractor and somebody paid us late or whatever, or asking for a raise from the boss. This is a completely autonomous situation, and everybody puts in what they think they should get paid. I know you've talked about that, and the other guys go, yeah, that's what you agreed to. And similarly, they have a clause, and it's not automatically executed. So that's something that's automatically executed. But they have a clause that their sales guy goes out and sells stuff. And in the contract that they sign for software development, like I said, it's a software development house, it says this contract must be passed by a majority of the people in the DAO before it becomes legal. And so then they have to pass, yep, we are taking on that contract. And that makes a lot of sense, because the guys might go, again, since they're kind of all freelancers, they could all say, hey, we don't have time to take that on. None of us are putting up our hand to actually do that development. And so, boy, that's really different than another kind of software house where the salesperson signs on it and the CEO says, okay, I got to hire 5 more developers. No, these are a bunch of guys who decide what contracts they want to take together and what contracts they don't. So it's really, that's an interesting implementation. And I would say that's approximately the extent to which it can be implemented today. That's about all you can do with it. And so that doesn't fit in with this idea of some big organization, because again, if you think about these guys, right, 20, 30, 50, how many people could you have voting on each other's salary before it became really unwieldy? And that's approximately the size of it. Now you've got some other larger DAOs that are doing things like deciding on investments together and funding together, but it's not the dream of we're going to self-govern and we're going to have this thing that is sort of the ultimate democracy that we all hold together.
Yeah, what you were just sharing about this payment model makes me think of a recent Money Talks where Avida Hancock was one of our guests, right? And she talked about one of her previous employers and how they handled that in a larger group of people, also deploying AI and sort of having a bit of a mix, if you want, between the individual assessment that people had of the quality of each other's work, having a gradient by which if I knew you better, then I had more say in that than if I only see you once a month, plus all the data in the background that was collected, quote unquote, objectively about how much you were participating in different things, how many messages you were writing. So I think there were things about what she shared that I actually that freaked me out a little bit, because it had a bit of a quality of Big Brother watching, right? But at the same time, I can also see where the potential of that is, especially when we marry it with technology, and then the question of scalability comes up, and the question is, can we have a self-governing system that is larger than 30 people if technology is not a key element of that in some shape or form? What's your take on that?
So Vida is definitely probably the person who's implemented the most impressive technology in this field. And I'm sorry that I'm blinging. I put an app on my computer today that I don't know how to turn it off.
Speaking of technology.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to figure that out. I'm like, oh yeah, I want the desktop app, and I'm like, oh, I don't want the desktop app. Anyway, so yeah, Vida is tremendous, and she's done more work and more impressive work than just about anybody I've known in this job. And she's not. And I've been spending several years, every few months, calling her up and you say, like, you sure you don't want to come into the crypto world and do the, because she's just brilliant. But yeah, so this idea of these autonomous organizations, I don't think we know what they look like, and I don't think that we really understand what we're saying when we say DAO. And one of the ways that I think about that is I think about religion. And I think about, so there's centralized religion. So Catholicism is a centralized religion, and you've got the Pope, and there's the Pope, and they're richer than God, just like a capitalist system, right? Centralized system centralizes the money. And then you've got Protestantism is kind of more fragmented, right? So it's sort of hierarchical, but it's also got different cohorts. And then you have Judaism and Islam, which are decentralized and autonomous. So you've got different rabbis that you might, I don't know as much about Islam, but certainly has different, you can go to any house of worship and they do the same thing, and you know what to do, and you know what the protocol is, and you belong to it, and you're in it. And if one of them breaks off, then they can do things. And Judaism is quite interesting because you could look at this DAO, and let's say you had some beef with the Jews, as happens every century or two, and you want to get rid of them. You can't. Nobody's in charge. Like, there's nobody in charge, and you try, and you get rid of one group of them, and there's still a group of them still being Jews over there, and they're autonomous from one another, and you can't kill it off, and you're trying, but. And then the other thing that's interesting about that particular DAO is it made a non-DAO. They said these. We said, some people a couple hundred years ago, we said, we should have our own country. And enough of them said, yeah, we should. And they didn't vote on it. There was no vote, right? You could say there was a proposal, but it was more like there was a manifesto, or there was an invitation. And then some crazy people moved over to the Middle East and said, we're going to drain the swamps, and some survived and some didn't. And then next thing you know, they're declaring it in the UN, and that's not a DAO. That's a hierarchical, traditional organization that the DAO created, and nobody voted for or against creating that. It was just there's a country now. That's really interesting, and we don't relate to that as an organization, right? Then there's Buddhism, which I would say is the Da, right? It's decentralized and autonomous. Maybe there's no organization called Buddhism, right? It's like, yeah. I'm meditating. Am I a Buddhist? I don't know, Yeah. And so that's decentralized and autonomous with no organization. That's a little more extreme.
No, but I think it's fascinating to think of religions and different organized religions through that lens, actually, and how, because that also teaches us that this way of moving in the world has actually been around forever, right? It's not a new invention, and just because we have a sexy name for it now doesn't mean anybody came up with it recently. It's actually what's your view on that? Like, in how far is that a natural way of organizing for human beings or nature?
So I think that there are primitives, or first principles, you could call them, right? I think there's some primitives that are natural and occur. And it was very interesting. I was having a conversation with Arthur Brock over a hackathon, various meals over the course of a hackathon from Holochain. And he would describe some of these different, and I did some writing for them as well. I wrote some of their white papers about how their distributed hash table works. And he would talk about a particular feature, and I would say, oh yeah, this is the law that correlates with that in Jewish law. This is how we do it. And so it's very interesting to notice that these seem to be primitives. There seem to be building blocks that are natural to how you have to think about things. So one of the things that he mentioned that Holochain does very different than blockchain is rather than preventing violations, there's warrants, there's enforcement after violation. And that's how humans operate, right? We don't have a society in which it's impossible to steal or murder. We punish you after the fact. And Holochain is based on that kind of idea that we correct afterwards. And Judaism is based on that fact also, which is, okay, we have these basic rules, and we can modify them as we go along if it turns out they don't go right. And there's different ways of modifying the code afterwards. There's no one truth. And that's another thing that Holochain says, there's no one truth and there's no time. And if you look at the Old Testament, it isn't written chronologically. There's some weirdness about time not being linear, which apparently, according to Einstein, is the way it is. And so this idea of blockchains they command you to have linear time in order to know what block was the next block. But it seems to be that one of the universals of self-organization is that you have to be flexible about what time something happened. You can't use a Newtonian physics for that.
approach. Okay.
Yeah.
And drawing on that, because you were saying there seem to be these universal building blocks, and it's nearly as if they have been observed post factum, right? It's not that somebody sat down and wrote a rule book, but afterwards you can observe how did something actually emerge? How did that work? What are the principles that seem to be happening over and over again in different places that we could now identify as DAOs? Is there anything else that you would say, well, that seems to be a common denominator?
I would say that what's one of the things that so I think that I think there's a canon, which is a protocol, right? There's a protocol that you follow in order to be part of that. You could think of Alcoholics Anonymous like that, right? Okay, if you're doing a 12-step program, these are the 12 steps. This is how it works. No, it's anonymous. It's this way, and there's a rule book, and anybody who follows the rule book can be an Alcoholics Anonymous chapter. And then there's drug, and Overeaters Anonymous, and all these different things. And there's no central organization. It's like there's a protocol book. And so that's interesting. That's interesting. So that seems to be, and the other thing is that one of the things I've noticed that there isn't a like a constitution or a manifesto, which seems to be something that a lot of us are very obsessed about. Like, oh, we've got to agree on our values in the manifesto, and first there has to be a manifesto, and then it works. And I don't see that. I don't see that in nature organizing either. Nature doesn't have a manifesto, but it has very clear rules, right? There's gravity, and that's gravity. There's water and there's land, and animals can operate. They understand water, land. There's two kinds of water. There's salt water and there's fresh water. There's, you can drink one of them. You can't drink the other one. And there's rules, and there's no philosophy behind it. There's no manifesto. So that's one of the things that kind of every time people say we got to work on our values statement, I'm like, I don't know. We got to, I have a little bit of an allergy. And in Judaism, there is it's very the law states, do and you will understand. Mm-hmm. It's do and you will understand. It's not philosophical religion. There's a lot of laws, you do them and then you understand them. And I think protocols is very important.
Mm-hmm. I actually share your sort of allergy against this shared purpose work and values work, right? Because I always think it ends up being this muddled mess of things that sound really nice on a poster on a wall, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It takes up a lot of space for what in the end. And also, and I would be interested in your take on that. For me, it conflicts with another belief that I have, which is one of these other beautiful gifts that I got from Peter Koenig around his observations of the principle of source, right? So he says, as far as he can tell, any initiative, any project, any organization, potentially any DAO, actually has one person who came up with sort of the founding impulse, if you want, who was the person who had the first, if we want to call it a bit esoteric, sort of download from a bigger field about something that wanted to be created. And that person, as the source person, is essentially the person from his viewpoint or through the lens of source who would define the values and who sort of defines the DNA of the project. So he actually also would always say there is no such thing as a shared purpose. You can have your own purpose, and then whatever you're joining, you check with what is the founding purpose, and then either you resonate with that or not, and you feel you can realize some of your purpose under that umbrella, then great. You play along for a while until you can't anymore. And so it is a hierarchical system in a way, but he sees it actually as a very natural system. It's something that there's an order that is innate. And I'm wondering, do you say, well, I think that's bullshit, or that doesn't resonate with me at all? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that source is a good way of thinking of that as a seed. And I would say it's frequently two people, but one of them is often quite transparent, right? So, it's like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, right? And so, or even Peter, right? His wife seems to show up a lot, right? There's that person who's listening for your greatness all the time, and doesn't let you vary from that. And I think that that's incredibly important. That can be one people or two people or three people, but I don't think we do a lot alone. Artists perhaps, but I think if you want to organize everything, that person who there's always one or two people who, when you declare something in the world, they follow you. And I don't always have that person. I do have that person, but I don't always have that person for a variety of reasons. But I have two or three people like that who have been with me on this journey around voice of humanity and DAO leadership. And it might change over time. One of them's been with me 12 years, but sometimes he's more involved, sometimes less involved. And when you make a promise in the world, the first thing your brain does is it goes, yeah, right. Like, I'm going to go out there and change the world. And your brain, in the back of your brain, it goes, yeah, right. I'm going to make $1 million. Yeah, right. And that other person, that's their purpose, is to say, they don't have your brain. They have their own brain. And they say, yeah, you will. And when are you going to do that? And for me, there was a moment like that with my children. I had created these kind of comic book characters and never did anything with it. And one day my daughter's like, you always tell us to pursue our dreams. When are you going to do that? And she's just like this little kid. And so you'll notice that I have these weekly calls, for example, on Wednesdays. And part of the purpose of these calls is to embarrass myself enough in front of people saying I'm going to do something that I have to do it.
Yeah. And sort of show up regardless, right?
Yeah.
And not have it be dependent on how many people will be there to, suck the knowledge from your lips. It's 2 people or 200.
It has to be enough to embarrass yourself into doing it, or push yourself into doing it, or have that looks for you. But I am the source of those ideas, but by bouncing them off of other people, something else gets produced. So, but there is
to link that to the source principles. I think what you said is very beautiful, because through Peter's lens, how I would frame it is, you have the original founding source, but of course, one person will never be a DAO by themselves, for example. So that means in order to realize a bigger vision, you actually need any X amount of autonomous subsources or specific sources, as we would call them, in your field, who within their own little area then are autonomous sources in their own right? And you as the umbrella source are just defining what is in and what is out, roughly, right? And then they do their own thing underneath that umbrella. And there's something quite fluid about that way of moving, because it actually means that you create a field with very permeable boundaries, but at the same time, sort of clarity of that, there is a membrane. It's not all equal. It's not like it doesn't matter, but it's not a rigid structure in which people join or leave.
Yes, and I would add one other element that I think that is missing from Peter's idea of the source, and from the idea of the source that we're talking right now, is we've been talking about the membrane and we haven't been talking about the field. And there's a time and a place for ideas. And there's a time when people, I've been talking about how money has its problems for a long time now, or maybe not that long compared to some people. Arthur Brock's been talking about it for 20 years, and I've been talking about it for 5 years, and like that. And now, since the pandemic, a lot of us people who are radical crazy people are finding that the people who said we were radical crazy people are like, there's something to what you've been saying, right? And there's different ways that ideas evolve and then become implemented in the world. And you can think of, a perfect example is the gay rights movement and gay marriage, right? Who led that? Whose idea was that? First of all, there's nobody's idea. Some people are gay. And then there was a time at which you could tell certain people about it. Maybe at some point you could tell your parents, but you couldn't tell anybody else. And then at some point you could say it in public. And then you've got people like, Ellen DeGeneres, who was willing to come out and sacrifice her career for it. And, Harvey Milk, who sacrificed his life for it. And then one day it became a law. And you're like, oh, wow, who's the source of that? And so there are things that, in order to produce that membrane, in order to produce the group that goes to court and shows up and does that, there is a leader of that, right? The Harvey Milks of the world. But he's inside of a field of conversation that has been developing over time.
Oh, absolutely. In a sense, I don't think there's any sort of breaking point with the philosophy of source as I would understand it, actually, because in a sense, I don't think there is such a thing as the gay movement, right? There are lots of tiny little blobs of movement, and they just have enough overlap in terms of their overall vision for the kind of world that they want to see being created, that it looks, if you zoom out far enough, it begins to look like a movement. But of course, if you zoom in, you actually see that these are all these separate fields with their own little membrane, and sometimes they sort of suck up to each other and connect, and then they disconnect again. And it's really like cells moving in a way, right? But actually, let us pivot back to DAOs and also the role of money, because I know that you've been dealing with money a lot, and you said you've been pointing out for a long time now, not as long as others.
A lot of money. Oh, you said dealing with money a lot, not dealing with a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. But yeah, so tell us something about that. What's the connection between money and DAOs? Or not?
That was a perfect segue, because it really is like this source versus the movement thing. And we have this tendency to look at stuff like, okay, we want to change governance and we want to change democracy. So we're going to make a voting system, and we're going to make a proposal making system, and we're going to make whatever, like all these modules, judicial system, or however you're going to do that. And so that's how we're going to change democracy. And those are modules. I'm going to call them modules for now. And what we're not looking is, how do we communicate between modules? So one thing that we have is there are certain standards that we use. One standard that we use right now is English. We're using English language. And there's only certain things you can explain in the English language. Sometimes you need art or music, and you can't explain them in the English language, and it's limited. And so the communications between the layers of democracy, you could say, happen in certain ways. And one of them is the language you use and the pieces of paper that you use. And now you can use cell phones instead of, once upon a time, you had to send a letter and it had to get somewhere in a certain amount of time. And then somebody got these pieces of paper and they had to turn the pages, and, and if right. So the communications methodologies really affect that. And money is one of the major communications modules. And money is very limited in terms of what it can communicate. And money, as we know it today, is the way that it's produced is problematic. This by debt, for example. One of the ways where I think that I kind of diverge a little bit from the discipline that you come from with the Money Labs is that this idea that there's enough for everyone. And theoretically there is, but if it's all produced by debt, then by definition, we're always, as humanity, in more debt than the amount of money we have. And so most people will be in debt all the time. And so it's actually incorrect mathematically, I would say, to say that there's enough for everyone if you produce your money on a debt-based foundation.
Oh, I fully agree. And actually, that's not one of the premises that we would follow at all. Actually, Peter was one of the first people who taught me that, there is nothing wrong with debt. Right. He said, if you do your inner work, one of the outcomes might be that you actually begin to be very comfortable with being in debt, because being in debt is your path to realizing your vision, which may or may not be the same for different people. Right. But also to think about what if we create systems, and that's, I think, where the link is to the DAOs, the way you describe them, where money is not the only bottom line, or at least not money in the traditional sense of the word. Right. Yeah. So what do you see are ways of communication then, essentially, that are relevant for a well-functioning DAO?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do with money is that there's this interesting thing. So let's just say that your goal was the same as the goal I stated at the beginning, is no unnecessary death. And then you would look and say, okay, there's enough food for everybody and everybody's got to get it. And so now we have to distribute the food. Now we use money for that. And so then the next thing you'll say is, well, now we have to make sure everybody's got a job. And that's a weird, that's kind of an abstraction from everybody has to eat. Everybody has to get a job now, especially if you're a parent or you're elderly or whatever, handicapped. It's like, okay, that's a weird abstraction in some ways, but we don't think that's a weird abstraction. We keep talking about we have to have more jobs for people, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. We've got to have more jobs for people. But what if there's, it's a certain amount of work has to get done in order for the food to get produced. And then other than that, why do we need jobs for people? Well, because so they can eat. It's like, right? And then you're like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. We're going to give them UBI, which is another abstraction for everybody deserves to eat. And so that's really interesting, is that we've used money as this abstraction. And then if you give people UBI, and we all know this argument, right? Well, what if they just buy drugs and don't get food for their kids? Yes, that's because you've created an abstraction rather than saying, hey, let's just have a supermarket aisle where one supermarket aisle is the free aisle and everybody can go there, and it's local food, or what the farmer couldn't, it doesn't look good enough to be in the main aisle or whatever it is, but we have the free aisle and everybody can just take from there, and then no child goes hungry because a child doesn't need money or something like that. And so those are pretty simple things that money has abstracted things, and it's also made it that you have to trade for it. And then if you were saying, okay, well, nobody goes hungry, so what would be a good distribution, and what would I need to measure? What would I want to know? Right? If you knew that your goal as a nation or as a city was that nobody goes hungry, what metrics would you be looking at? And you wouldn't be looking at GDP for sure. You wouldn't be looking at the average income. You wouldn't be looking at the minimum wage. You'd be looking at food on plates. You'd be like, where's the foods on plates number? I want to see the food on plates number.
Yeah, and the days that we spend, and the days filled with doing something that you actually love doing. There could be all kinds of different measurements, right? So, if you could join any DAO right now, which one would it be?
I'm a Jew, but and I didn't get to choose that, by the way. That just happened,
Well, but the whole Jewish thing is, of course, you're one of the chosen people. So you're born into that. It's
it's
right,
chosen.
It's
chosen in that way. There's a myth that the God held the mountain over the Jewish people and was like, "Would you like to be Jews and take these commandments from me?" Because all the other people had said, "No, we don't want the commandments." That's what it means to be chosen. Is God holds a mountain over your head and said, "Would you like this now?" So I'm not a member of any DAO right now. I mean, I've looked at the Token Engineering Commons. They're very interesting, and they're not exactly a DAO, but they're doing some interesting work. And I think Seeds has this HyphaDAO, or DAO, or whatever they're calling it, has very good, interesting functionality that's more advanced than a lot of the other things. But none of them appeal to me right now because they're all still using the main communication method of money, which is, okay, if you join the DAO, you can make proposals and you can get funds. And I'm like, I can, I got work. I'm not.
Well, Grace, let's put it this way: what would be a sexy DAO for you? Like, if I were to create a DAO that you wanted to join, what would I need to do?
Just start your word with sexy, and I'm in, man. Okay, like the dating DAO. I'm single. Tell all your listeners that I'm single. I think that it really would. I'm very interested in food right now. I'm very interested in things, and I'm starting to get very interested here in Slovenia. Like, what would it look like if we had? It could be a DAO-like thing to make. We have a farmer goes out of business every week. How do we stop that? How do we create a collective so that we can stop farmers from going out of business? I mean, I've known for years, suicide rates among men with farms is very high in Europe because you can't make a living. The food DAO would be how do we start seeing our food supply as belonging to us in our own countries, at the very least? And how do we bring dignity back to those professions and have a connection between ourselves and the people who are feeding us? I would be very interested in that DAO.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I think what it also points to is another abstraction that money has brought, where suddenly the amount of money that you make has anything to do with your self-worth as a human being, right? And if you don't make money with the job you have or the profession you have, then you're in consequence, you're worth nothing. And it sounds like to me that that's also one of the things that we need to disconnect or need to redefine if we want to have functioning DAOs moving forward.
Well, as you can see, I'm quite post-money in my thinking. I really think money is a corrupting force, and certainly in farming, it's a corrupting force. And you have these, you see this software now, and this is really a corruption of money, and you see it all the time now. And how you can read some really amazing articles about how money is taking over farming. But now you've got these sensors and these apps that'll tell the farmer how to get the most yield out of his crop. And who's programming that AI? It's going to be the big companies who are selling him this chemical to put on his land, which is going to put him in debt because he's going to buy that stuff, and then he's going to be in debt and lose his farm. And that's been happening for years in different formations. And so this is really where money is anti-human in some ways. So yeah, I mean, I would say this is a way of looking at, you know, what is our human connection beyond a monetary connection, and how do we mitigate those kinds of, yeah, and why are farmers so low paid, and why are teachers so low paid, and the people who do the most important work in our societies, caretakers, and and the people who make the most money are, you know, lawyers and financiers and people who aren't adding any value, the people who are, you know, on Wall Street for the sake of argument. I actually worked on Wall Street for about a year when I just got out of college. I just thought, wow, these people move money from place to place. That's all they do.
Yeah.
And what's the value to society of that?
Yeah.
And yet these are the highest paid people in the world, and all they do is like move a bit from one computer to another computer all day long.
You know, for me, that really is the connection to, of course, the field that I spend all of my time working in, right, is to look at what is the inner work needed in order to create the structures and the processes and the systems for the future that we actually need. And I really do think as long as we have not disentangled this notion that money is somehow adding quality to our lives, right, that it makes us safe, that it brings us freedom, that it brings us security, and therefore we are hoarding money in these giant piles, or at least some of us are, which is then not flowing in, because, you know, through you, I actually learned that currency actually comes from current and sort of a flow, and how that has been perverted as well over time, that people are just sitting on these piles of money, and like Donald Duck, what is his Uncle Dagobert Duck? Yeah, and you know, sort of counting their money as if that was a worthwhile thing to do during your day. And I do think it is necessary that we begin to feel ourselves in a different way, right? And to feel what brings true quality to my everyday life. And it is being fed, having a full tummy. It is having time to spend with people that I love. It is having time to spend doing things that I find interesting. And if we were to redefine a worthwhile life on those terms, then none of the money herding and shifting money from place A to B would even make any sense anymore, right? So, yeah. But Grace, thank you so much. I think this would be a wonderful time to actually open up to our listeners and participants here. So if you would be so kind to just turn on your videos now, that would be great, so that we can have a conversation with you. Yeah, and Marcus unpinning us, so that we can go to gallery view and just see who is there. So, hi guys. Yeah, so I'm just curious to hear a bit what's, you know, what resonated there, what maybe didn't make any sense because it wasn't clear enough yet. So there are no stupid questions and there are no stupid remarks. So just put it out there. And you also know me, if I don't get any hands, I will take my liberty to call on people.
There is a question in the chat. I don't know if we want to go into it.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the question is, how is money created? And this is one of the things they don't exactly tell you, but I think we can see it very clearly right now. So they have this idea that there's this idea they kind of say is that the government prints money. And this is inaccurate. The government doesn't print money. The government takes money out as a loan. So right now, all of our governments are in debt to banks or to the EU or something, because they've taken out a loan for the money that they've given us to cover COVID expenses, for example. And so every time a government issues money, they have to take out a loan in some way. So that might be something called government bonds, which most people know what a government bond is, but they don't think very hard about it. But what that means is that the government is in debt to you all the time. And the government isn't just printing money. If the government printed $100 and got $100, that would be not, it's problems, but it's fine. But what happens is that the government prints $90 and they owe $100, right? So that it's like they're always in debt. And the way that most of the money comes into existence is through banks, which decide to give you a mortgage or a loan for your business. And that money is just out of thin air, or even credit cards, right? If you have a credit card, when you click your credit card, there's no money somewhere that pays that vendor. It's completely invented until you pay back your credit card. And so everything is running around this kind of debt cycle, that's how money is created. 97% of money is created as debt. The other 3% governments actually do print. That's called inflation.
And Mike, you have a follow-on question to?
Yes, I would like to speak a bit more about it, because this is not really right approach to money. Money are created not from the debt, money are created from the credit, let's say, effect. When one person to another person is buying something in credit, promising to pay him back, or promising to give him something that can be used in order to pay somebody else. And so when somebody is going credit, another one is going debit. And here money comes from. So the debt concept is not actually debt itself. It's just a way to count how much money were printed, so how much money were created and injected into the system. Then inflation is kind of a different process. So I would rather refer to money as a result of claims that people do to each other. For example, when government, and we are speaking about independent governments. When government is printing money, it gives claim to the people that it will take this money in form of taxes for the governmental public services to sustain regulation in people and provide them with that stable ecosystem when they can do business and they can do like personal relationships. So that's it. And if
what's your take on that?
Yeah, so this is, I obviously, this requires research, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. And this is the only person I know of who's actually done this research. And what he did was he went to a bank in England and he took a loan and he asked them to transfer it. It's really fascinating. You should look at it, because what you're saying is, okay, how do we know that when a bank issues money, they didn't just write it on the books, that actually they took it for somewhere? Because like you said, in mutual credit systems, if I said, hey, Nadia, you're good for 10 euros, she's in minus and I'm right, like to me, right? I mean, like that. And then that's equal. There's no interest bearing. Just pay me 10 when you get around to it, right? As soon as there's interest bearing, if I said, look, that's fine, I'll give you 10, but you got to pay me 11, that means she owes more than there ever was in circulation, right? So, but in order to know whether it was invented out of thin air or not, you have to look at the books of the banks to know what happened. And the link that I showed is a guy who actually did that. And he found out that the money is invented out of thin air. There is no debit anywhere on the bank's things. He went to a big bank in London and he did this. And so you have to, you have to actually investigate this. I don't know of many studies that have done this, but I think that the crash in 2008 showed that, oh, wait a second.
No, actually, there are a lot of studies about it, and if you should.
I don't want to get into that argument because I think it's beyond.
No,
the
just
scope of
I
what
would like to point on the fact that you're confusing a bit two different things: issuing money that is made by the government and through the central banks, and then banking system that is loaning this money and like creating money out of money. And here comes the interest, and here comes the problem that you're speaking about. So just not to put people in confuse.
What I would actually say, if you have
so.
other interesting links, then please post them in the chat, because I think there's, this is such a wide area to research, and there's so many interesting experts in the field. I watched the video, Grace, that you posted as part of your course and found it fascinating. But Mike, if you have other sources, I'd be very interested to look at those as well. Just want to say that Jonas also had his hand up with another question. So Jonas.
Yes.
Yeah, or maybe also in addition, because first of all, I think money is also a social innovation. So it enabled us to do a lot of things. And as far as I sort of know a bit about money history, I think it used to be, at least when the first currencies were established, was a collateralized property that was made in a way into a currency. So we more and more lost the connection to something real the further we abstracted it. now I find this quite interesting that in a way it's sort of the trust is the binding element. And what does this mean also for the DAOs and how we deal with money and to what extent we can push this trust? So it's not really a question, but I think it's for me a bit of a connection also to maybe those decentralized organizations, because trust is sort of the basis maybe of a lot of things that we do on such an abstract level.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I would say two things to that. One is, yes, money is an amazing social technology, and it's brought us to where we have gotten today. And it is a technology, and it gets outdated, and it's done amazing things. And it was invented, however, at a time when what we thought was valuable is different from what we think is valuable today. So at that time, we didn't think you could fish all the fish in the sea. So we thought, well, you didn't think you could cut down all the forests. So cutting down a tree is worth more money than, a live tree. And now we're like, oh no, air is really valuable. Like air, we're going to need that. Clean water is really valuable. But so our measurement system was appropriate for the time at which we made it. And I'm not saying it was a bad idea at the time, but it is outdated, is what I would say to that. And it's not trust, by the way. And the thing that I think is very likely to replace money, at least in part, is reputation. The ability to make transparent reputation. And you could see that before Airbnb was around, we did this couch surfing thing, right? And couch surfing was just based on your reputation, you got a place to stay, which is normal, right? If I said, hey, Nadja, you can come stay at my place when you come to Ljubljana, I know her and you've got a good reputation. And you look like you keep your house clean there. It's, you and your partner can come. And that's reputation, right? So I think that eventually we'll expand that out to other kinds of privileges that we can get. And she said, will you be on my podcast? Yeah, I know your podcast is going to be great. I want to be there. I'll give you my time for free. And that's reputation based. And she invited me because my reputation was good. And so I think we're going to see more and more ability to visualize and transact based on reputation. And that wasn't possible in the past. We couldn't have a dashboard like that in the past, but now we can. You look on Airbnb and you see somebody's reputation.
So I would be fascinated as well if there's anybody else who, moving a little bit away from the money conversation into, again, the DAO space and sort of what is resonating there. Carsten, you have your hand up?
Let's see if I can bend it back to the DAO space. But what occurred to me as Grace was talking about reputation and reputation currencies, it looks to me like we're still talking about trust then. Like my reputation signals whether you can trust me, and money in a way is printed trust, as long as we all believe in that. So what does that mean about DAOs?
Well, DAOs have tried to implement reputation systems, and it's very interesting to see how they've done that, in what ways that's succeeded and failed. And the idea behind a reputation system in the DAO is you should be able to vote on proposals in proportion to how reputable you are. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If you're just some person who joined yesterday, you shouldn't be able to have the same vote as somebody who's got a history of 20 years and understands exactly what we were trying to accomplish and knows about the mistakes in the past. And so the idea of reputation and voting is also very salient, and many of the DAOs have been trying to implement different types of reputation systems. Common Stack has something called praise, which you accumulate and gives you voting rights, and DAO Stack had something called reputation that was, and you could use that both for voting and for something called holographic consensus, which prioritized the proposals. So what should we decide on is a good question, right? We get to vote on everything, but we can't vote on everything. So what should go up at the top? Reputation could be a very important factor in what do we prioritize. So DAOs have been experimenting with reputation because it is essential. And are you really a person you said you are? Are you a citizen of this country? I mean, you get a vote if you're a citizen, but otherwise you don't. And yeah.
Carsten?
Yeah, I think I kind of recognize where I was going with this. So if in essence money or DAOs or reputation systems are a way to make sure that people behave trustworthily, then I wonder what would happen if we went at it from the other direction and help people become trustworthy people, you know, to get to a point that you don't need all this stuff because, well, they're good, trustworthy people. And how and if a DAO might be a step to like in that direction in any case, because, you know, if you have a hierarchical organization, that probably means, yeah, I can't trust the people, it has to be top down. And the DAO thing is kind of a step down the road of what if people were trustworthy, what if people became trustworthy. And yeah, then I just wonder what would an organization look like that facilitates the growth into that kind of person, rather than trying to incentivize the behavior, because, you know, we've seen that again and again. If you just incentivize the behavior, then it becomes artificial in many ways. It isn't, you know, it becomes a control thing.
So I love that perspective. It's very different from my perspective. and look, we aren't that good. We're egotistical, we're selfish, we're arrogant, and we are corruptible. And the more we start being good and awesome, the more we think those other people were like, why are they not as good as me? They should be good like me, you know, like I'm better than them because, you know, I'm doing good work in the world and they're just, you know, and pretty soon, all of a sudden, being a good person goes to our head. And we've all seen that with our leaders. We've seen that with ourselves. And I make great decisions. I shouldn't listen to anybody else. I mean, it's called Napoleon syndrome. It's actually very well known in the management books. We don't stay good, even if we are good. It's amazing. It's like we bounce back. We're just not designed that way. That's why ethics is about choice. There's always a choice. And so we do have mechanisms, whether we like it or not, we have mechanisms, right? None of us recycles because we get 5 cents back on our bottles. It's either because we're a good person or the neighbors will look at us this way, you know? And we all have certain things that we do because the neighborhood will look at us this way, and we may or may not, or our parents will think this about us. And this is natural. There's nothing artificial or external about imposing social norms. And the reason that I think DAOs are important and these ideas of reputation are important is because our social norms don't scale and our problems are global. How do you be a good global citizen? That doesn't look like the same thing as being a good neighbor or a good child, or, you know, and so I think we need to expand our natural system of imposing social norms on one another at a global scale, but in a way that isn't, you know, Black Mirror-y, you know.
Carsten, do you have one more point? Because I'm actually also thinking, I was, you know, I know that you're dealing with DAOs in the sense of trying to think about what are the designing principles of what you would call elegant villages, right? So
not at all. This has nothing to do with that. No, let me just ask one thing. So I completely agree with you, and especially where we're at currently, we need what you're talking about. But what if we started with the assumptions that humans can become adults that are trustworthy and that don't get corrupted by power? What if we assume we could get there? Then, you know, why? Oh, because it would be so much cooler.
What evidence do you have that people don't get corrupted by power, that that's possible?
I don't have any evidence. I just say, let's make that as an assumption and see if we can get there. But okay, Nadia,
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I'm just assuming that people are designed that the way that they're biologically designed. I'm not assuming that they're biologically designed some other way.
But Grace, then the question for me is, you know, that is a very different framework for what is really truly at the core of being a human being, right? But if that is your belief, for example, that actually ultimately power corrupts human beings, and that's not a bad thing, it's just sort of a natural thing, if I heard you correctly, then the question for me is, how do we have to design then a DAO so that risk is being minimized in essence?
This is a great question, and this is what most indigenous cultures, a lot of indigenous culture is about, is how do we deal with ego and sociopathy, and religion is about that. I mean, is the human question. And there are many techniques, and how do we build that into our structures? And, I don't necessarily have the answer, but I do think that there's a lot of hints in religions, in indigenous cultures, and because that, I think that is the essential question, right? How do we, and it's the essential questions, for ourselves. How do we live a good life and sleep well at night and feel good about ourselves? And for me, it's a big question. How do I not get corrupt? I was recently offered a job, and I'm working, and I'm looking at how do I make sure that this particular organization that they're asking me to advise for doesn't end up corrupted, and I don't end up corrupted by the incentive system. It's really, it never ends.
That's a big, exactly. It doesn't end. And I would be so delighted also to hear from Felicia and from Ilona, just thoughts around that, right? What is your interest in DAOs? Because you joined for a reason. What is your experience with that maybe in this field? And any other thoughts you have to add? I'd love to hear from you.
Maybe one thing regarding the human being again. There's actually a book. It's written, I think, only in German, but it's called Im Grunde gut. And
basically good.
Yeah. And it's exactly about. So the author, kind of disproves this whole theory of that we are corrupt and that we are egoistic and all of these. I didn't read it yet, but he basically, he says we are good. So that's on that. And then why I joined this call is I'm working at the moment with this very visionary founder, and I don't know if you've heard of the passion economy.
I've heard of it. I didn't go deep into it, but I have heard of that.
Yeah, so it's basically this new blue ocean economy, and it's all about providing a good infrastructure to people where they can basically make a living from their passions. And this whole thing evolved a bit from influencers and like this space, but now with and at the moment we are connecting cryptocurrencies to it. So we launched a token, and basically the idea is, so he's this very visionary person, and I also can't explain every detail, but he has this vision of a human stock market, he calls it. So basically where we all become independent of like the centralized systems like banks and politics and all of this. It's very visionary, and I can't grasp it yet fully, but I then discovered DAOs because we also think of how can we set up our organization, because we think to kind of deliver on this vision we have to become a bit of a role model for how this is supposed to work also for the customers of the product. We are globally distributed already, fully remote, completely asynchronous. And as we are building this cryptocurrency ourselves, we have already a lot of knowledge about blockchain and also how this works. So I was also thinking about how would it be if an organization is running on a protocol and all of these things. So that's actually why I joined this call. Mm-hmm. It's still a big, it's still very, very confusing to me and a lot of things.
Right. So first of all, you might want to look at my GitHub or at the voiceofhumanity.one site to look at the white paper that I wrote, which just really talks about that. Like, what are the different elements that you might want to put in order? It's like a 40-page white paper. Secondly, if you want to be independent of the existing system, you need food. And that's why I'm so interested in the food DAO. And I think that we are incredibly blind to that. It's just like, oh, we're all going to do what we're passionate about. Well, who's going to grow the food? Yeah. And if you've ever been at an eco village or anything like that, you can see that these people are passionate about growing food, and they're educated people. They're some of the most educated. They're like, have you read? Oh, I read this. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't have time to read, right? They all get to live in the passion economy, but half of the day, that passion has to be picking olives. And And I think that it is definitely feasible. And you don't, and one of the things I say, if people sometimes ask, like, how do we incentivize people to do what they're really passionate about? Well, you know, right? Like, you don't have to incentivize people to do what they're passionate about. You just have to take away the limitations.
Yeah.
You don't have to give people money to do what they're passionate about. You just have to give them food and shelter so they don't have to be slaves. And then everybody will do what they're passionate about by default. And so that's part of why I see freeing ourselves from money is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Grace, I think I just found the link to your white paper, so that's in the chat.
Yeah, that's the white paper. Yeah, and it's not the most latest thinking that I have, but it's very good for exactly what you're saying. I mean, you know, we spent several years working on that paper and thinking about what are the different elements of a distributed organization. So I think that'll be very helpful for you.
Cool.
Great,
Thanks
so much. Ilona, any thoughts on your end about what that is triggering, knowing that you're going to be some kind of a village source in pretty soon?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Grace, because I've been wanting to hear, you know, some of your thoughts since the Congress very impatiently, and have been following you since then. So I'm very happy to have been here today. And, you know, it's really triggering a lot of things. I do agree with this question of food, but I mean, I would expand a little bit to like the basic needs, and becoming more resilient for our basic needs. And of course, that includes food and water and how we deal with our waste and that kind of thing. And I think that, yeah, what I like about what you're saying, for me, processes, and I see DAOs from what I understand them, and I don't know much about it except for a few things I read and just today. But what I get it, what my current feeling is that it can be very useful and interesting when we need to set up processes, as you say, that are on a more global level, as long as the technology or the process doesn't take over the human, or something like that. So that's kind of where I am now, and that's kind of where I am in general about a lot of these technologies that allow for very innovative ways of working together, of living together, is that in general, I see them as amazing tools that we should use in as long as it's at the service of what's happening on the ground, and not the other way around. So yeah, I mean, what I take out of this call is to really stay open-minded and look into all of this, and I think that the idea of creating, you know, protocols or rules, kind of universal rules of an organization or of a community that's working together, could be a good replacement to religion or any kind of other philosophical, well, kind of other rules that don't necessarily always come from an inspired place, but most of the time are not necessarily applicable to the specifics or to the and are very free to interpretation. I would put it that way. So I think that's an interesting field of exploration, and I'm excited to some further reading. So thank you, Grace and Nadia, for opening this world up.
Yeah, I love how you brought that together, this kind of the rules and also the humanity, right? The rules have to change, because often I'll hear people say, yeah, well, the AI will make better decisions for us. And AI knows how to replicate things, right? Like, okay, if we can all say this is a ball, eventually AI will know it's a ball. But I'm like, but we don't have a good way of governing ourselves. So what are we going to tell the AI to replicate? First, we have to get a good system in place, and then we can say, okay, now we can automate it. But right now, we don't even have a good system, and and so this fluidity between the rules and the humanity, which you're pointing out, Ilona, I think that's really where we are right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what I find interesting is I don't know about all people here in this room, but I know for myself, for Ilona, for Carsten, one of the things that drives us is also that question of how do we create more conscious collectives and, you know, essentially DAOs that have some answer, or at least evolving answers to that question of self-governance in a way that works better than what we've seen before. Yeah, so for me, it's also a very personal question, right? Because I want to be part of a community like that. How do we make it work, right? And where do we turn for examples of at least parts of it that are already working? Because I do know they're out there. Yeah.
One of the things that I think that we don't like to talk about because it feels weird, but and because it's not well implemented yet, is this, okay, well, if we want certain behaviors, how do we measure that, right? And so, because people write these manifestos like we want, I actually was invited to a meeting, and it's just a perfect example to where they were talking about this stuff. And, you know, how do we implement this stuff? And we want a really open group, and, you know, equality and all those things that people always say. And in the meeting itself, I noticed that when somebody said something that didn't agree with what the founder who signed the checks said, and the founder didn't agree, it was ignored and just ignored, right? And not brought up again. And then if the person brought it up again, it was usually like the second time it was like, oh, we'll put that in a document over there or something. And I also noticed in the room, it was very clear, the recording is available, and I told them this, that when women wanted to give an idea that was contrary to what the founder thought, they would do this rigmarole of like, listen, I was just thinking, and, you know, and these kind of, and then they would do this thing, whereas guys would just say it directly. And the guy would be the one who would repeat it when it was ignored, and the woman would not repeat it when it was ignored, right? And so you could measure that. You could measure equality. You could see that women were behaving, and you had the recording. And so we don't like to talk about it, but there are measurable things that you could expose and be measuring for in that way, and things like, how do people behave, and what do we do when somebody disagrees with us, and how was criticism actually handled in that meeting? Let's watch the replay.
Yeah. And, you know, and actually, Grace, a couple of years ago, went to a conference where I met a woman from the UK who was working in a startup in London who had developed a software, an AI-based software exactly for that. So they record board meetings and meetings of top teams, and then they analyze them and give them a complete recount of what actually happened in the room and contrast that with their own self-assessment, right? Because I do think that one of the first entry points into more awareness is simply that, is more awareness, right? Because half of the time we are blind to our own biases. So whatever isn't working in our governance structure is completely opaque to us. We just have no idea. So that is maybe one of the first steps that we can actually take, is whether that is AI based or whether it is based by just implementing better observational processes and the way we work together, that's necessary.
Yeah. Ray Dalio has a talk on his principles. It's a TED talk by Ray Dalio about this rating system that they have, where in a meeting you choose a category, and you're like, it could be openness, it could be whatever, and you're always rating all the other people in the meeting on that. And so over time you see, you know, oh, and then he'll be like, oh, nobody was convinced by my point, you know, and everybody rates everybody. So the CEO is rated, and that's one way. And then the other way you can, you know, if you wanted a transparent organization, you could say, okay, how often, you know, there's a place where you press a button if you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, and it was relevant to your job, right? And then your job isn't, you know, then if that happens a lot, that people press the button, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, and it was related to their job, you don't have a very transparent flow of information. And so you could measure these values that we say these are our values. You can measure them, and you have to just think, okay, what are those measures, and should it be automated or not automated? Should people report, etc. And I think that we're very reluctant to do that because it does feel Black Mirror-ish. But on the other hand, if you're not measuring it, you're not getting it. Yeah. You know, does it feel fair to you? Like the Gore companies do that. They have did it feel fair?
Yeah.
Measure.
Ilona, you have a last point, because I'm also looking at the clock.
Sure. And I just wanted to say that as soon as a collective says we want equality, then you know that means inequality is in that same collective, and that they have something to live with that particular question, or that they have, you know, some kind of journey to take. So that's also very interesting. It's also about these constant blind spots that we set ourselves just because we want to focus on something, and we only focus on the light and don't focus on the dark. So it's just relating to what Grace is saying. But so I'm just saying, like, you can, of course you can measure it, but also before measuring, or before they accept to measure it, I think just that consciousness that if you want to, you know, have an equal, if equality is your theme, then inequality is your theme too, just at the start.
Yeah. Well, which brings us to the polarity work, of course, right? Yeah. Okay, you guys, Rebecca, thank you so much. Grace, sorry, Rebecca, Grace. I always get confused with your two first names. Do you actually use them both, or do you only use Grace?
When I moved to Slovenia and I moved to a new industry, I just renamed myself, but I didn't do any of the official paperwork. So on all my paperwork, it's Rebecca, but people have been calling me Grace for about 5 years now. Okay,
well, lovely. Then we'll stick with Grace. Thank you so much for being here. I think this was a very thought-provoking theme today. I'm going to dig further into that, and I hope all of us here will join us in this endeavor, because it's sort of work in progress, right? Is essentially what I hear you saying, is that there is no perfect answer yet, but there are different DAOs that have been around for, you know, shorter or longer time periods, and what can we learn from those who have been around, and continue to be in fascination in a way in this observation process, and pick and adapt and learn and emerge. And thank you for your input in that regard. And I will definitely read your white paper.
Yeah, and I have a Telegram group, which I put in the chat, and I do have weekly regular calls that are just open calls for anybody on a variety of topics, and we choose the topics ourselves. So people are certainly welcome to keep staying in this inquiry.
Yes, and Grace, if you do have a link for us for your next workshop coming up around the future and what it used to be, I'm also very happy to put that in the email that goes out with the recording to everybody. I've participated in her program, and Carsten did as well, if I can out you here, and it's been eye-opening. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you for everybody for showing up and being here and asking your questions and having your comments. And yeah, let's stay in conversation. I think that's the best we can do. And may the DAO be with you, or whatever we can to close this session.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Grace.
Thank you.
One last thing, Grace, regarding your weekly or monthly, whatever calls.
Weekly.
So nice if you could post that on the Create Love and Business community that I'm now going to enliven again and open up, because it would be so great that I could share the information to some people I know through that channel.
Fantastic. Great idea.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Have a wonderful evening, Gracie.
All right. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, Mark, I think we can stop.